if I can get your attention, please. So we are doing this acoustically today. So obviously down here, we just want to keep the volume down. If you want to have a chat, or you just want to like get some fresh air, you just want to head out, that's fine. Just head upstairs and yeah, grab a drink at the bar, just grab a seat really. It's good. But yeah, I was going to come up with something clever and technical and scientific today, but all I could say is when it's about 2011 when I first moved to Leeds, and I used to go to YFC near me and play a chicken shop, and they had like a 2 for 1 offer, so it was like 2 chicken burgers and 2 portions of fries. And what I used to do, my kind of ritual, was to come back home and then turn the atheist experience on, and then yeah, consume the whole thing somehow. I don't even think Amy had the stomach for it anymore. And even though Richard wasn't one of the hosts at the time, I've been a fan of the show ever since. And I'm really happy to have Richard here today to give this talk.
Thank you. Yep. Cheers for that, Kris. Can everybody hear me? First of all, because I need to. If you can't tell me, I will shout up if I need to. Obviously, as Kris has just said, I have been a host and am a host on the Atheist Experience. I'm going to read a lot of this, by the way, because this is over an hour long. So if any of you are bored by philosophy, by the way, I'll just introduce myself first. I've been working with Atheist Community of Austin, that's in the States. So why am I working with the Atheist Community of Austin? One of the producers saw me some stuff I was doing and asked me if I would host one of their roundtable talk shows. So I said yes, and been doing that for about 5 years now, and I have been producing Talk Heathen, which is another one of their shows, for about 3 years. I do been invited onto various other call-in shows, talk shows. In addition, I am writing a paper with one of my student friends at the Open University, all about faith. So that's something I'm really interested in. My degree is in religious studies, philosophy and ethics. That's where my main focus of stuff comes from. I'm writing a book about the history of religion in Sheffield, which is purely a religious studies-based book. No religion bashing in there. I am working with religious people, and hopefully as this talk goes along, you will realise that I'm not about bashing people. I'm not interested in, bringing people down for their religious or supernatural views. This is all about talking with people, working with people, and accessing how they look at the world and interpret the world, and that will become apparent as the talk goes on. I'm also writing a book on epistemology, which is all about how we make decisions, how we interact with the world, how we find out what is true or what is likely true. And that book is largely where today's talk comes from. You are all test subjects for the second chapter of that book. So bear that in mind. Feel free to shout, jeer, whatever you want to do. I'm pretty easygoing. So how we're going to do this today? First of all, we're going to talk about philosophy. We're going to talk about why it's important. We're going to talk about what we should avoid when we're discussing philosophy. Really, really important things. Being online, being in the internet world, it's very difficult to have good philosophic conversations, because we tend to get 2 kinds of extremes, which I'll go into in a bit. Reality, what is it? And how do we know that it is that way? We're going to talk about that. I'm going to take you on a journey through the universe. So hopefully that's going to be something really, really important. At some point, I'm going to nick back there and get a balloon. That's really important. We're going to do a little experiment. And then we're going to talk about consciousness. We're going to talk about what it is, how do we or it interact with the world, and we're going to talk about mistakes that the brain makes. And that covers a whole vast area. So finally, what we're going to do is we're going to tie all that up, those 3 subjects up, into what is the best way to assess our beliefs. and we're going to put it all together to form a cohesive picture. And hopefully, by the end of it, we'll all be on the same page. Hopefully, you'll all agree with me. So we'll see. So, let's get into it. Philosophy. Why is it important? Well, actually, it's boring. It's really boring. It's arrogant and it's boring. So a group of chaps, probably white, more than likely middle-aged, beards and glasses in abundance, sat around looking down at people beneath their social standing, and talking about those people and what makes for truth, reality and morality. So take Plato, for example. The ideal man, as proposed in Plato's Republic, is the philosopher king. And as Bertrand Russell, in his A History of Western Philosophy, states of the Republic, one of the conclusions arrived at is that rulers must be philosophers. Not sure I entirely agree with that, but why, then, I hear you ask, are you, a middle-aged white man with glasses and the occasional beard, who is academically educated in philosophy, telling us about people who you're perpetuating snobbery in academia and philosophy? And that is a good question. It's because despite philosophy being tediously dry and dull, it is immensely important. David Hume would state that to begin with clear and self-evident principles, to advance by timorous and sure steps, to review frequently our conclusions and examine accurately all their consequences, are the only methods by which we can even hope to reach truth and attain a proper stability and certainty in our determinations. That mouthful, on the surface, seems to be very much in line with the scepticism that I, at least, am promoting. There's a very clear and obvious problem, and that's that clear and self-evident principles to begin with, axioms, as we call them in philosophy, we don't have a way of assessing whether they are wrong because they appear to be self-evidently true and confirmed by reasons or empirical testing, which relies on assuming that the axioms are true. So you can see the kind of circle we're going in here. It's a big forever circle. We can be sure of one axiom of all others, though, and that is that we exist. That must be true. We're whole here, clearly. According to a philosophical principle called solipsism, which claims that the only thing we can be sure exists in our mind, then yes, we must all exist. But everything else we experience, everything, might not. Not the external world, not the other minds we interact with. I could be here talking to myself. Welcome to metaphysics and the idea of the simulation hypothesis, as proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom. This is the suggestion that we might all live in a giant computer simulation, and has been popularized in modern culture by science fiction. Probably the most famous example of this is the movie, anybody? Matrix, exactly, yes. The Matrix 1999 film where computer programmer Thomas Anderson, played by Keanu Reeves, better known by his handle Neo, stumbles upon a shocking truth, that we live in the Matrix. The Matrix is a computer simulation created by AI machines, and the popular version of the simulation hypothesis has been examined by Franco Vazza, senior researcher at the University of Bologna, who knows a thing or two about simulations, having studied, and I'm going to take a breath before I said this, the origin of extragalactic magnetic fields and the evolution of comic structures, using very big numerical simulations. He's a very clever chap. His findings are forthright. We showed that this hypothesis is simply incompatible with all we know about physics. That's his conclusion to it in his 2025 article, which was published in Frontiers in Physics. As with most philosophical concepts, There are many other models of the simulation hypothesis, but you get the idea. To assume that we exist in the world and occupy with all the other people we live amongst that most basic of axioms is something that's not as universally accepted as we might first think. No, we can't be certain that we exist. At least not in the way that we perceive. But if we have axioms that appear to conform to reality through empirical testing and reasoning, surely that's the best methodology that we have of determining anything. I would propose it is. Regardless of my opinion, and this is a really, really important point, what I'm promoting here is not the truth, or rather not the only idea about truth, because my intention is not to promote that it's my way or the highway when it comes to methods to ascertain the possible truth or reality that we live in. What I'm suggesting, and by the conclusion I hope you will all agree with me on, is to convince you that skepticism, as I lay out here, is the best method that we have to say this is likely true to the maximum I can be sure, given the tools we have to analyse it. I mentioned that philosophy was boring, but it's not only boring. Not the dull parts, of course, those bits, the aforementioned academics playing journal tennis with their pet ideas, that's boring. Not the ones on social media speaking down to people about their precise academic epistemological definition of atheism, that is heart-rendingly tedious. If you only knew the numbers of people I've interacted with, philosophers, I've seen do this and inevitably finish their sentence with, I'm a professional philosopher. I have a master's degree in philosophy, so that gives some kind of weight to their opinion. There is, unfortunately, a necessary undergraduate tedium of Wittgenstein thinks X, but when you skip this and bypass the philosophy bros, that area of social media where people without any formal training in philosophy lay out a syllogism that was new in the Middle Ages and has aged just as well as the hygiene from that period, you kind of get into knowing what I'm talking about. But it's not always that easy to skip past. Worldviews in themselves can be a stumbling block to the academic conversations about philosophy. Worldviews, for me, are great sleep medication. However, when we get to those conversations on social media, it may become extraordinarily combative. One of the hazards of producing and hosting a popular call-in show where we discuss worldviews is that it's inevitably that a proportion of those calls will be overly emotive. The difficulty with these conversations is often finding the subtle beginning points from which to begin. If I take it as an axiom that God does not exist, and you take it as an axiom that God does exist, we've already fallen over each other. If truth is grounded in God for you, then regardless of what I say, no matter how convinced you might be of what I say, then by definition, it cannot be true because it's not grounded in God. This is why I propose we agree on reality before we even get to the details of the conversation. I found that most people, regardless of worldview, can agree on what is real and what exists for most things, for the vast majority of things. The skepticism I propose comes in two stages. First, assess what reality is, then assess what things appear to be in line with that reality. In other words, what is a reasonable criteria for examining what things are true? In doing so, anything we have that's surplus to our agreement, we can discuss. This cuts out the problem of worldview comparisons because we've already agreed that for most things, what is real and true. We can then concentrate on those additional things and see if that assessment we are using for them is in line with reality. It's not a new idea. This was first proposed by a guy called William of Ockham, who came up with a scientific principle called Occam's razor. Occam's razor is attributed to a Franciscan friar, Franciscan, I can't speak, from the 13th and 14th century. Although the idea itself is not original to him. The razor is a simple version of a probability theory. And it gets misused a lot. People think it means the simplest idea is going to be more often than not the correct one in lieu of any other explanation. It's not. What it actually proposes is that the idea with the least amount of assumptions is more than likely going to be the correct one. It's not a hard and fast scientific law, but nevertheless it is immensely useful when we apply it as part of a scaffolding technique for examining what is likely true. So what is important about philosophy is that it allows us to ask questions that prompt us to wonder, explore ideas, and reach for the unknown. When you get into a rich and exciting set of disciplines that allow you to wrestle with and be awed by the possibilities, and that's really important for me, that awe-inspiring nature of it. Mind, the universe, and our place in the vast foreverness of the cosmos stops being dry, stops being old white guys with glasses and beards looking down at people. It becomes accessible for everyone. It becomes exciting for everybody. And as you can tell, I get really excited about it, even though I'm nearly 50. That's just because I'm sad. There we go. Learning about the various fallacies and when to apply them is vitally important to recognizing flawed thinking. And here is the thing that makes this exceptionally interesting. It is not a case of waiting until you are in formal debate with someone to start applying this awareness. You can do so in your own thinking. Learn a couple of simple fallacies to begin with, and when you're comfortable with them, start trying to recognize them in your own thinking. When you do start spotting internal mistakes in your own thinking, then you get this profound kind of eureka moment of, is my brain really that bad? Is my thinking really that bad? Because it really, really is. And when you start then applying them to conversations you have with other people, it becomes really interesting noticing that pattern you've recognized in yourself and how that relates to other people as well. I do recommend that you don't do this with close friends and family. Don't just start pointing out logical fallacies that they're making, because they will likely punch you in the nose. So we're going to investigate what this all means. And we're going to start by applying the sum of all things, everything, existence itself, the universe. So, reality, what is it? Get poetic here. We are dizzyingly small in a vast ocean of infinity. Poetic, perhaps, and yet analogy, allegory, and metaphor are appropriate, maybe even necessary to try and convey the vastness of the universe. This is because the universe is not just big. I'm going to argue that it is reality itself. Is that a challenge? Yeah, possibly. But come on the journey with me, because I'm going to walk through some numbers and ideas, and by the end of it, I think that you will be convinced that when we talk about the universe, we're not just talking about just that thing out there, but we are in fact talking about, to borrow from the title of science journalist and theoretical cosmologist Dr. Paul Parsons' 2018 book, everything. So how do we know? How do we know this? We're going to begin by looking at some numbers. But rather than just throwing huge numbers out and a bunch of facts in the air and trying to catch them with a trawler's net, because it's not very fun doing that, I'm going to give you some perspective so we can hopefully and truly see the fullness of what is being suggested. Psychologically, 13.8 billion, bookmark that number, we will come back to it, doesn't seem a big number in today's world. In 2023, there were 3,323 billionaires worldwide. The most billionairest of them all, and was and still is, Elon Musk, with an estimated 328.5 billion US dollars as of March 2025. That's a lot of billions, and makes our number of 13.8 billion years seem paltry in comparison. This figure, the approximate age of the universe, has been estimated remarkably accurately by two independent, and some might say even a friendly level of competition between them, spacecraft. The Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, WMAP, I've been dreading saying that for the past week while I've been planning this, and Planck Probe. When the universe began 13.8 billion years ago, the bit that we can see needs explaining, because this is getting very, very technical now. So I want to explain this by doing a little experiment with you. So if you'll just bear with me 1 second, I'm going to fetch some balloons and a marker pen. What am I going to do with some balloons and a marker pen? You crazy man. Right, what we're going to do first, other than dropping the balloon, is blow into it. Some of you may have seen this done before. I'm going to demonstrate the expanding universe here. So we're going to draw with our marker pen. No, we're not, because it's not working. That's failed miserably, hasn't it? I'll just explain it instead. So when the universe expands, test things, Richard, before you speak publicly. I think that's what we can take away from today. So when the universe expands, we have, let's say, this wonderful table of 4 people here. Everything is moving away from each other because the universe is expanding in every direction. So if we imagine that our place in the universe is one of those tiny dots, or one of the people at the table, from our perspective, every other thing we can see is moving away from us at the same point as the distances increase. We'll get to a point where those other dots disappear over the horizon. While we are all familiar with how horizons work on Earth, maybe not those who believe in the flat Earth, maybe there's a bit of disagreement there. Don't know if we've got any flat earthers in the room, have we? No, good. That makes it a lot easier for the question and answer section in a bit. The cosmological horizon, as it's known, is not there because of curvature, but because the universe is expanding at a faster rate than light travels. So the light from beyond the horizon quite literally never reaches our eyes. So how do we work out this horizon? The distance between two objects is known by cosmologists as the proper distance. This is the distance between any two given people at the table we looked at in our experiment. And this is always getting bigger. The cosmological horizon in the observable part of the universe we discussed earlier is 46 billion light years away if we consider this proper distance. Hence, 92 billion light years away if we consider the whole observable universe. And that might seem confusing at first, but if you imagine you stood 4.6 miles away from the horizon, then you turn round and you're 4.6 miles away from that horizon, altogether, the observable part of it is 9.2 miles. It's the same principle. Anything that within that horizon we can see. Anything over the horizon we can't. Simple? Not quite. We can't see back all the way to the beginning of the Big Bang. In fact, we cannot see anything before about 380,000 years after the Big Bang, when the temperature of the universe dropped to a positively chilly 3,700 degrees Celsius, which was known as the era of recombination. This allowed protons and electrons to combine and form the first atoms before the universe was full of plasma, and that was known as the radiation era. This wouldn't allow these atoms to form. Only when the universe was cooled enough for the formation of atoms were photons free enough to travel, and the universe became transparent enough for us to see the most distant past. So to simplify, protons, electrons and photons were at a party. The organiser had the heat turned way up, and because it was so hot, nobody wanted to touch the sweaty person next to them. Everyone was filling the spaces in the room evenly, so the photons couldn't move freely around the room. Someone eventually turned the heat down enough so that the electrons and protons got close enough to each other to think, I fancy a bit of that, and coupled up, leaving the photons enough room to jig away on their own. And that is how the universe started, a great big party in the sky. Good, got that? Let's move on. The free distribution of photons caused what is known as the cosmic microwave background radiation, or CMB. How the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation came about is probably one of the most famous in science, and includes pigeon poo from a pair of exceedingly troublesome birds. That was confused by the interference from the Big Bang. The people who discovered this were Arno Allen Penzias and Robert Woodrow Wilson. They're the team behind the famous pigeon poo story, and they won the 1978 Nobel Prize for Physics. Not for cleaning up pigeon shit, but for discovering the microwave background radiation. With that discovery, we have definitive evidence for the Big Bang theory. We're going to come back to the Big Bang shortly, because there are some common misconceptions about it that need clearing up. But for now, we're going to return something that's very important to our claim that the universe is everything. That is the phenomenal size of it. It's well and good knowing that the visible part of the universe is 92 billion light years across. But as we've already seen, it's very easy to have brain to dismiss big numbers. It really is, depending on the context of what we're saying. So I want you to come with me now. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the math so that we can really grasp the light, the way we measure the speed and size of the universe isn't a measure just of distance, but of time itself. So I'm assuming we've all heard of the speed of light, 299,792,458 meters a second, exactly. Or if you're old like me, 186,000 miles an hour, a second, sorry. And as Albert Einstein famously told us, nothing can travel through space faster than the speed of light, kind of ish. He never actually specifically said it word for word. Rather, it's explained in his 1905 paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies. I've read that, so you don't have to. It is immensely boring. So the first thing we're going to do is just have a think about what 186,282 miles per second looks like. Because 186,282 miles per second means that light travels around the Earth at about the rate of 7.5 times in a single second. But does that mean anything to anybody here? Because it doesn't to me. I don't know what that means. Don't know what it means. So let's try and think of it in human terms. We can use a driving time calculator, and again, yes, I am boring, I have done this. We can input 186,282 miles into that and say, let's say speed of 55 miles per hour. Most of us know what 55 miles an hour feels like. And this is exactly what we want. It's exactly what I want you to do today. We need this human connection instead of simply throwing random numbers about. This gives us the answer: 3,386 hours and 57 minutes. We can get this into something that feels familiar by dividing it by 24, and this will give us the number of days it will take to travel this distance. The answer to this is 141.122917. So in real terms, just over 141 days, which equates to just over 4.6 months. Again, we should stop at this point, take stock, because I don't think people really let these numbers sink in enough. We rush through things, and this can't be rushed, because ultimately we're talking about the size of reality itself. So I really want you to stop and have a good think about what the size of the universe in relation, not to these big numbers, but to you, and to you, and to you. All of you, all of us. It's important. So, we don't want to think about it as a vague concept in billions of light years. Not yet anyway, we're going to get there. Not as a diagram of the Big Bang on a couple of inches across on a page, which we see in scientific textbooks. That's not going to help us. We want to view it as a real measure of time in your own life. So let me give you another example to really try and hammer this home. My father was diagnosed with cancer at the end of August 2012. He didn't live to see 2013. That's less time than this journey at 55 miles an hour would take us. Devastating news of a terminal illness to the death of someone who has been there your entire life. And had we been making this journey, all that heartache, all the emotions, all those last goodbyes and tears would have taken place in the same distance as it takes light less than a second to travel. Really important to get that human connection when we're thinking about the size of this. Now think about your own life. Think about what 4.6 months means to you. Really take stock of what you could do in that time instead of travelling 186,282 miles. Hopefully we're getting somewhere on the same page now. 186,282 miles a second, or a light second, is fast. And this is important. It's important because we started this journey being psychologically bamboozled into thinking 13.8 billion light years was a small number. It's not seeming that way now, is it? It's not quite that simple. Now, if we times 186,282 by 16, yes, I've done this maths as well because I just get increasingly boring as life goes on and not less. This will give you 11,176,920. This is the distance that light travels in a minute. Now let's get back in the car. Even rounding it down to dead on 4.6 months, if we multiply that by 60, we get 276 months. That, for the quick multipliers amongst you, is 23 years. Travelling constantly at 55 miles an hour for 23 years will take you the same distance that light travels in 1 minute. Just think about that. I think that's amazing. 23 years ago, 9/11 was fresh on everyone's mind. It only happened a couple of years before. 23 years ago, looking around, I'm assuming some of you probably weren't even born. And in that time, you've grown to have spectacular taste in speaking guests, all of you, every single one of you. So, let's have a think. In our cosmic race, this is the time it would take us plodding along at 55 miles an hour without a break to cover that same distance that light travels in 1 minute. Shall we continue our journey? 11,176,920 times 60, you will get 670,615,200. This is a distance light travels in 1 hour in miles. If we were to do this in our car, it would take us 1,380 years. Were we to take this trip into the past, we would arrive approximately when Alexandria revolted against Arab rule. King Kenwal of Wessex would be driven from his kingdom by King Penda of Mercia. In the east, the Empress Kogyoku had abdicated her throne, which was taken over by her brother Kotoku, and in the Americas, the Maya were beginning to build their grand cities. Along the way, we would have passed Islam's golden age, the Battle of Hastings, the Protestant Reformation, and both world wars, travelling the same distance in our modest and yet apparently well-engineered little car, as it takes a single hour for light to travel. We could continue this epic journey, but I think you've got the picture. Light covers a lot of distance and time. And I think we need to change units of measurement, although I implore you when we do this to consider what we've just talked about. Just really consider that vast amount of time and distance that we in our human experience would experience in the journey of light. It's essential to retain a connection to the vast distances and deep time, because we'll be addressing very deep time. We can't just let them become big numbers in our ears. The unit of measurement when talking about cosmic distances is the light year, and this is the distance that light travels in a single year, and is used because the universe is so big that standard measurements, such as miles, would be absolutely and utterly useless. I've already mentioned that light speed measures distance and time, but think about what this means. When we're measuring things in units of light speed, we're not just measuring distance, but we are also looking back into the past. When you see light from the sun, you're looking 8 minutes into the past approximately. This is because it takes light 8 minutes to reach us, travelling at 186,282 miles per second. So we'll bring our car back out of retirement one last time and drive at 55 miles an hour into the sun. Or rather we would, if we could. Because like our previous journey into the distant past, this would exceed the lifetime of even the longest lived amongst us. At 55 miles an hour, it would take us 184 years travelling without rest to reach the sun. We're about to start getting big, really big. So before we continue, let's take a minute and imagine just how big the sun must be to dominate our sky when it would take us 184 years to drive to it. For those of you who are puzzled, by the way, because I know some of you are going to be asking this, haven't we sent probes to the sun that took less than 184 years? The answer is yes, but they travel faster than 55 miles an hour. For example, the Parker Solar Probe is the fastest human-made object ever built, and it was recorded at travelling up to 430,000 miles per hour during its approach to the sun on December the 24th, 2024. So moving on, our nearest cosmic neighbour in the star world is Proxima Centauri. Next door, in this case, is 4.2 light years away, which, as we will by now be familiar with, means that it would take the light travelling to us 4.2 years to make the journey. Not only does this mean that we are safe from any flirtatious babysitters from there, unless they can travel the speed of light, or we are into much older partners, but it also means that when we see the light from Proxima Centauri, we are looking 4.2 years into the past. Both stars, in fact, every star we can see individually in the night sky is part of our local galaxy, the Milky Way. So we're really stepping up the scales here, and we still have a lot to get through, so I suggest trying to digest each of the following pieces of information in relation to those numbers we've already looked at. You've already done the necessary work. Now it's time to bask in the awe-inspiring eternity that is our universe. The Milky Way is between 100 and 200,000 light years in diameter and contains anywhere from an estimated 100 billion to 400 billion stars. Just think about that. I think this is almost incomprehensible. I really, really do. How amazing it was to think about travelling 4.6 months to travel in a car the same distance that light travels in a single second. And now we're talking about our universe being 200,000 light years in diameter. Modern estimates of the number of galaxies in the universe are a dizzying 2 trillion. And I don't use the word dizzying lightly. I really, really don't. The reason I don't use it lightly is because I can't really comprehend what that means. It's such a vast, vast, vast number. So now I want to return. I went a bit Sheffield then, didn't I? So now I want to return to the number I asked you to bookmark. 13.8 billion light years. I hope by this point, if someone says to you, the universe is 13.8 billion years old, you won't compare it to Musk's billions of dollars, but instead the phenomenal distance that light travels in a second. I also hope that you will have enough of a grasp to understand that awe and not true comprehension is the correct response to this knowledge. And enough amazing facts to have your friends at parties. So, it's important at this point to give a short explanation of what the Big Bang is, or more properly, what we believe it to be. It's necessary, I think, on 2 counts. And the first is to understand the idea correctly so we can understand why the universe being everything, that is reality itself, is not some fantastic whimsy that I'm just trying to throw out there to convince you of. The second reason is that some people do not understand what the Big Bang is, but don't stop there. What they want to do is go out into the world and spread the word about what the Big Bang is not. That's not very helpful. The matter and energy making up everything that you can see around you in the world today, everything was all born out of that one single instant of creation. There you have it. Paul Parsons, theoretical cosmologist, said it, so it must be true. But just because an authority figure says something, even if they are an expert in their field, it's not sufficient to simply accept it. In fact, it may well be a fallacy. And this is important to remember. It's really, really important to remember. Doesn't matter whether it's your parents, whether it's teachers, whether it's scientists, whether it's faith leaders, religious texts, or even me that's saying something. We should always be prepared to check both the source of the statement and the methodology used to arrive at the conclusion. Really, really important. Because we need to do the work. We don't just have to believe someone's opinion of what the Big Bang is. We need to see why the theory is true. In 1917, Einstein, we met that guy earlier, he told us nothing could travel faster than light. He began to apply his theory of general relativity to the universe, but he ran into a bit of a problem. It seems to show that the universe could expand. And Einstein thought this must be wrong. He didn't like the idea. So he wrote some clever equations to try and balance this out. Fortunately for us, Russian mathematician Alexander Friedman sent a note and manuscript to his friend, an Austrian physicist called Paul Ehrenfest, in 1922, explaining how Einstein's theory did indeed show that the universe could expand. Friedman published a paper about it in the journal Zeitschrift für Physik. That was on June 29th, 1922, to which Einstein wrote a response in which he essentially called Friedman's work nonsense. Shots fired. Friedman was apparently undaunted by this crazy-haired lunatic. I made that bit up. Einstein's hair was only a bit crazy in 1922, and he certainly wasn't a lunatic. He responded with some clever calculations, and in 1923, Einstein admitted his own calculations were wrong, and Friedman was, in fact, correct. He outmathed Einstein. Sure, that had it been a thing at the time, he would have also been going that, saying loser under his breath. Because that's what scientific people do. Despite this sizable ego boost, he understood that this was still only theoretical, and that's not to be confused with a scientific theory. But despite the math seeming to work, Friedman knew that there was no observable evidence to back it up. And he wasn't the only one. I want to jump forward in time a little bit to 22nd of November 1951. In an address to the Pontifical Academy, Pope Pius XII declared that the Big Bang was proof of the Book of Genesis. This claim was also echoed in 2014 by Pope Francis. And yet, there was a voice of dissent against the claim made by Pope Pius, and that voice belonged to a Catholic priest. So what? So what? We might say. Sure, there are lots of Catholic priests who don't believe in the Big Bang. And you might be right. Problem is that this one was George Lemaitre, the man who came up with the theory in the first place. Lemaitre was brilliant, and not just because he was brilliant, because he really was brilliant, but he did what should be, but is not always done, in many fields of research, and he separated, as much as one can do, his personal bias from his professional work. And that is really, really important. He also acknowledged, sometimes to a fault, other people who had informed, or in some cases merely preceded his own work. For example, he took to calling one of the equations from his 1927 paper, let me take a breath before I say this, a homogeneous universe of constant mass and increasing radius, accounting for the radical velocity of extragalactic nebulae. Yes, those scientific folk are really exciting with their titles. The Friedman equation, after our old friend Alexander Friedman, even though he was not aware of the work when he wrote the paper. I like Lemaitre, and his genius was not just in coming up with the Big Bang Theory, which is most notable for, but for bridging the gap, or more correctly being both astronomical and mathematical. Einstein, you might have guessed by now, was not always complimentary, and he wasn't the only one. British physicist and astronomer Fred Hoyle famously, in fact very famously, used the term derogatorily. Only he didn't. Well, he did, kind of. He wasn't a fan of the idea of the Big Bang. But the famous slur that occurred on the BBC's third programme on the 28th of March 1949 and gave the theory its name was not actually meant as an insult, according to Hoyle himself. Whether you want to accept the idea that Hoyle didn't mean it as a slur, the name stuck. And despite Friedman's acknowledgement from 1924 that there was no evidence to back up the expansion of the universe being observed, this was by this time overturned. There was still a lack of observational evidence for the Big Bang itself. And that was until a pair of pigeons did some poo in a radio telescope. Now, I want you to think back to the experiment earlier with the table full of people or the balloon, had it worked. If we take any one of the felt tip pens we drew onto the surface of the balloon, what happened? When the balloon expanded, every other spot moved at the same rate. This principle not only proves that the Big Bang was not an explosion, but describes one of the fundamental assumptions that we have about the universe, and this is called the cosmological principle. We might be tempted at this point to slip into asking assumption. So are you saying it's not true? It's important to note that the cosmological principle is not simply a throw it in the air and see where it lands idea. It's confirmed by observable evidence in the part of the universe we occupy and has made successful predictions about the universe at large. The cosmological principle proves that the Big Bang was not an explosion, but it tells us something else that's really important about the Big Bang. It didn't happen at a single point. So if we imagine our table of 4 over here again, imagine that we reverse it down to its most tiniest level. Each one of those people sat at that table. Each one of those people was present at the moment of the Big Bang. So as the universe expanded and as those people moved away from each other, that point of the beginning is present in each of those people. This is where physics gets mind-bendingly fun. So it doesn't matter whether it's at the quantum scale, the size of a family car, the size of a continent, a planet, galaxy, and the largest scale of the universe, the Big Bang happened everywhere. Now we're getting one step closer to understanding that the universe is everything. But before we move on, sit with what we've discussed so far. We now understand that the Big Bang was not an explosion. It was an expansion. And it happened not at a single point in space, but it happened everywhere. Those prone to over-egging their analogies might at this point be eagerly raising their hand enthusiastically to point out that balloons expand into something. So that must mean that the universe likewise must be expanding into some as yet unknown medium. I'm going to come to that next. This really pushes the limits of our intuition because the facts about the universe are, in many ways, counterintuitive. It's crucial to remember that we are not talking about something within something else when we're discussing the universe. We are talking about space-time. It's a closed system. The universe cannot be expanding into anything because the universe is everything. To state that there's an outside to the universe is as ridiculous as saying that you can have a married bachelor. Now we're going to have the tiniest foray into quantum physics, and not in the spiritual sense. I don't know if any of you are on Threads. I'm going to digress from the script a second here because this is important. If any of you are on that wonderful social media platform Threads, it has exploded recently with people trying to connect spirituality and quantum physics, and it's done my head in. I've had to resist. I have seriously had to resist having some conversations on there. So what is quantum physics? It just means the part of physics that deals with the very small. Molecules, atoms, subatomic particles and things of that nature. And it's vital for many aspects of modern life and forces us to contemplate reality itself in a completely new light. This is going to be very important for our grasp of the universe being reality because it's important to understand that weird stuff, hard to grasp ideas, things that might appear to be fantastic can be demonstrated with evidence. And that's really important. We shouldn't use it as an excuse, as my friends on Threads, to invoke the supernatural. So why do we need to talk about quantum physics? When we're talking about reality, we need to understand something that will be very apparent when we talk about consciousness. Although there is a reality, our reality as a species has a particular perspective. We've got to be very, very careful not to confuse that with meaning individual reality is just as real for everyone as everyone else. From within the framework of our species, what we're talking about there are opinions, and some opinions are more correct than others. What I mean by our reality having a particular perspective is that as a species we view the universe in a particular way, and that we've discussed so far has been largely about the human angle. But underneath this view is a whole other world. The easiest way of understanding this is to think about a computer game, and no, to be clear, I'm not going to start suggesting that we live in a simulation. Imagine you're watching a character in a game. While it appears to be a person, it's wearing jeans and shoes and driving a car and interacting with all sorts of environments, from deserts and cities. We understand that none of those things are quite as they seem. They behave the way they do because the underlying programming. While the universe doesn't have a programmer instructing it how to behave in the same way the computer game does, it does have an equally invisible world operating at a level that we can't access, simply with our human senses. But it does affect what we can see. This is an aside, and I want to take us into the tantalizing world of consciousness. If any of you have seen me online before, I know Kris has, I don't know where he's hiding, he's over there, you will know that this is my bag. Consciousness is my thing. I love consciousness. I was on the Ways to Human channel a couple of months ago, and I spent over 3 hours having a conversation about consciousness. And I've been there on 3 times and talked about consciousness on every occasion I've been on. I love consciousness. It's my thing. So, what is it? What is consciousness? The great thing about this question is it's the wrong question. And that for me makes it exciting, because what seems like a perfectly reasonable question being wrong means we're missing something fundamental. And I think rather than asking what is consciousness, we should ask, how does consciousness? And I think that puts it in the right ballpark. There are multiple views in philosophy and science about consciousness. And my aim is not to tell you that mine is the only one and you should need to learn about. But I do think that the way I understand it has the best explanatory power. And that's because I include something that virtually every philosophy forum on the subject leaves out, and that's non-human animal consciousness. But we'll come to that in a bit. This next bit's exciting. And it's exciting because I received one of the lowest scores for any philosophy essay I have ever handed it in for expressing the following view. So let me stress before I say this, before you all start scratching your heads as to why I'm telling you about an idea that on the surface it seems to be crap. It wasn't the idea itself that I received a low mark for. It was because it was supposed to be a philosophy essay, and I strayed into the realm of neuroscience, and thus outside the parameters of the question. We live and learn. Monkey see, monkey do. Get your degree. Imagine consciousness as intentional locomotion, as opposed to an object being moved by the wind or another object acting upon it. While we could use several things that cause locomotion, from a range of vehicles to animals, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use a car. That's because my day job is in the motor trade. I'm not a used car salesman, by the way, if anyone's thinking. No, I am not. When a car has all the components in the correct place and is functioning correctly, the result, when the vehicle is activated in normal use, is locomotion. Likewise, when a brain is functioning normally, the result is consciousness. We can extend this analogy to deal with several other things that we may find with consciousness. It sidesteps the problem of qualia, the idea that reductionism cannot explain the feeling of experience, because we don't need to connect locomotion to a reductionist breakdown of individual parts of the car. That there is locomotion because of the car is self-evident. And not being able to say locomotion relies on a door, a tyre, or a drive shaft, which we can't do, doesn't change that. Really doesn't change that. The experience of locomotion, just like the experience of consciousness, is a byproduct of the car in working order. And this leads us on to another extension of the analogy. When the car is not working in order, it is impaired. So we could say that the car's gone into limp mode, or it could stop altogether. Neurological studies are rich with example of this impairment in consciousness. Neuroscientist David Eagleman recounts in his book, The Brain, The Story of You, the case of Hannah Bosley, who has the condition synesthesia, and as a result has the experience of letters appearing as colours. These small changes in the wiring of the brain demonstrate to Eagleman, who has studied over 6,000 synesthesiasts in his lab, that internal reality can be measurably different in laboratory conditions. Furthermore, the very way we measure legal death is through the ceasing of brain function. And the way we measure that is through the lack of conscious response. Without overstretching the analogy, the example also accounts for something else that we see with the brain. We can stop locomotion without the car being broken or even switched off in the same way that we might not experience consciousness when the brain is in certain states, such as under anaesthetic or in deep sleep. Where the analogy is most useful is for challenging the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem was first proposed by philosopher and cognitive scientist David Chalmers in 1994 and widely gained popularity in philosophy, and it relates to the explanatory gap between objective matter and subjective experience. In other words, locomotion cannot be reduced to the wheels of the car. Therefore, locomotion cannot be explained by the physical car. There's a very important word in there that really highlights the problem of the hard problem, and that's cannot. And I want to concentrate on that. Most people who accept the hard problem of consciousness, and this is a consensus opinion in philosophy, with it being estimated that just over 60% of philosophers accept the idea according to a 2020 survey. And this includes Chalmers himself, that reducing consciousness to the brain cannot explain it. Oddly, in the same survey, just over 50% accept a physical source for consciousness, which I think shows that those who accept the hard problem, not all of them, view it as not being able to be the source of consciousness, even though they accept that there is a problem. I want to go to the pain of stressing that it is the strict form of the hard problem I'm addressing here, that held by Chalmers himself. I want to shift that claim, the idea that because there is an explanatory gap, that this means that consciousness cannot be reduced to the physical brain, to any other field, to highlight it for a minute. And I don't want to do so subtly. In fact, I want to use a hammer, and that hammer is Thor's. Imagine having the same opinion as Chalmers at the turn of the first millennium in Scandinavia. Electrostatic charges cannot be the source of lightning because there is an explanatory gap between these charges and lightning occurring. Can you see why I'm getting frustrated? While we can all see clearly, we can all accept that first millennium people don't have our knowledge of how lightning formed, and therefore they had an explanatory gap. I don't think anybody in this room, at least I hope nobody in this room, would think that that means that it cannot be explained by electrostatic charges. Likewise, we can shift forward to any modern scientific problem. Cosmology and neuroscience and biology and geology, all scientific fields in fact, are full of ideas with explanatory gaps and competing hypotheses. But I don't think many, if any, people would claim that because we have those explanatory gaps, those hypotheses should be dismissed because they don't currently explain the phenomena. And that is why many of the proponents of the hard problem of consciousness do suggest. Rather, and I speak of a student of philosophy here, I think we should follow the neuroscientific route, which is to largely sidestep it and recognise it as a kind of pseudo-problem for consciousness research. Let me stress, I'm not going to the lengths of some neuroscientists who would just dismiss it outright and say it's not even a problem. I think it's worth considering, I really do. So, I hope you agree that it's reasonable to see consciousness as a process, something that is the result of the brain body working in a certain way to produce a process in the same way that all the working parts of a car produce locomotion, rather than a thing like a car in and of itself. And I think that when we consider non-human animal biology, this point really does strike home and hard. And I think that's ironic. And the reason that this is ironic is because the hard problem of consciousness was profoundly influenced by a 1974 essay by Thomas Nagel called What It's Like to Be a Bat, which explains, as we've just explored, that the physical brain does not explain subjective experience and that we can never know what it is like to be a bat. The irony comes in because when we examine how consciousness interacts with the world, we will find that non-human animal consciousness is bound, literally bound to the physical attributes that the animal has, how they behave, and what we know about how they perceive reality is intrinsically tied to their physical nature, brain size, and nervous systems. It turns out that what it's like to be a bat, far from informing the hard problem of consciousness, gives us our strongest indication that the physical is not only the source of consciousness, but shapes how that consciousness is experienced. And that's what we're going to explore in the next section. So how does consciousness interact with the world? I'm going to address this section in two parts. The second will deal with how we humans literally construct and interact with the world that we see around us. But first, I want to return to Nagel's bat. In fact, all animals, including ourselves. I've been thinking about this idea of the way as a species interact with our own species-specific interpretation of reality for a long, long time. But I didn't have a name for it. That's until I came across a fantastic book by a science journalist, Ed Yong. My background is in philosophy and religious studies, so I have very limited knowledge of biology, apart from where it interacts with the brain science. So one day I was reading this book by Ed Yong, which turned out to be about what I had been thinking and talking about for several years. And even better than that, he put a name forward to this species-specific interpretation of reality. In his 2022 book, An Immense World, he introduces the term Umwelt. And this was exactly what I was looking for. This concept comes from the Baltic German zoologist Jacob von Uxel. And he came up with this in 1909. And it means specifically in an animal's perceptual world. Not got a time to go into a full rendering here, but it turns out that elephants and bats and dogs, birds, spiders, snakes, scorpions, sharks, insects, turtles, whales and octopus, in fact it seems all animal life, each species has its own Umwelten, its own conscious interpretation of how it interacts with the world. And it's intrinsically tied to the physical makeup of the animal in question. We have language because we have a unique social structure which developed alongside the neocortex, that part of our brain which first appeared in small mammals 200 to 220 million years ago, and in the past 2 to 3 million years expanded rapidly. Now, accordingly, around 80% of our brain mass is made up of the neocortex. Dogs can smell so well because their skull is constructed in such a way that it allows them to have up to 300 million scent receptors. We've got 6 million. Mantis shrimp can see ultraviolet, infrared and polarized light because they have 16 types of color receptive cone cells. We have got 3. And octopuses, with their paltry 9 brains, and nothing compared to the leech, which has a whopping 32. I could go on and on and on, but I think you get the picture. The physical makeup of a creature is intrinsic to its conscious experience of the world. The evidence is overwhelming. Consciousness is uniquely tied to the physical structure of the creature and how it experiences its unwelt in entirely dependent on its physical makeup. I'll die on this hill. It's borderline criminal that animal biologists who study consciousness are not included in consciousness forums. For example, I was recently sent a YouTube video by a good friend called What is Consciousness? A Question of Science with Brian Cox. It was hosted by the Francis Crick Institute. The panelists were Auntie Seth, Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience, University of Sussex, Katerina Schmack, Consultant Psychiatrist and Group Leader of a Neural Circuits and Immunity in Psychosis Laboratory from the Francis Crick Institute, Steve Fleming, Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience, UCL, and Alex O'Connor, a popular content creator and philosopher who is host of the Within Reason podcast. Not a single animal biologist who studies non-human animal consciousness amongst them. This isn't a one-off, it is the norm. Is it snobbery of the intellectual kind that we noted in philosophy right at the start, with the assumption that only human brains are worthy of discussion in such forums? Or is it an oversight? I suspect it's a mixture of the two things. But what it is a limitation. And I can't help but feel that our knowledge of consciousness, which is currently in its infancy, would expand just as quickly as the neocortex if we started including biologists in this conversation. It's not a wish, it's a necessity. But now I want to move on because we need to talk about us as a species and our unwelt, because this is vitally important to how we assess our beliefs against the backdrop of reality. And I love that a dog's just started barking when we're talking about animal consciousness. That's great. You're in an old woodland. It's pitch black, except for your torch. You're not familiar with the area other than one bit of information you have learned. In fact, this is the reason you're freezing your arse off at 11 o'clock at night to begin with. In the woods lies the ruins of an old, long since demolished house, and the former occupant of the house, a lady dressed in white, is said to walk these woods. There are many aspects of psychology that come into play in this scenario, and it's one I've witnessed unfold many times as a former resident skeptic in a ghost hunting group. So let's take our little woodland visit and see what's happening psychologically, because this is very important for how we interact with the world in general. It's a good example because it's an extreme example of how we operate in everyday life. And that might be a bit of a surprise. But nothing that's happening here is out of the ordinary, just as it allows us to see the ordinary in an amplified state. So let's examine what's happening. In psychology, we talk about sensation and perception. Sensation is that which describes a physical input about the environment which is received by our sensory receptors. Perception is the way in which we make sense of this information. Sensations are largely the same. We all smell bread, but our perceptions of it are different. Are we hungry? Do we have pleasant memories of smelling bread from our childhood, etc.? Our brain takes this information, organises it, filters it, and chooses the bits that it thinks are useful from those that it doesn't. And this can be influenced by our mood, our level of tiredness, and many other physiological factors. The difficulty is that there is a lot of information coming in all at once. And that's a lot of filtering that the brain has to do. And more importantly, the brain doesn't just take a picture of the world using this information. It also has what is called in neurology the internal model. In short, it's already built a picture of what is out there based on previous experience. And when it receives the new information from the sense organs, it cross-references all that with the internal model. For example, if we're walking around a familiar room with the lights on, there isn't much going on. The internal model and the external stimuli match up. There's less margin for error. The brain is doing less work. However, if we are in an unfamiliar place in the dark with little new information from our sense organs, our internal model is still active and still trying to cross-reference the external data. But when there isn't any, or very little, then it will form a picture of the world anyway. And if we are presupposed to believing in, let's say, ghosts and ghouls, we might be more inclined to imagine that this little bit of light we have seen, or that knock, well, we have an explanation to hand. And when we are in a place we are not familiar with, have little information coming in, and have been given specific details about this location being haunted by a lady in white, in psychology, being fed this initial information is called priming, then that picture we build will relate to the information we have at hand. So, you're in an old woodland. It's night, pitch black, except for your torch. You're not familiar with the area other than a bit of information you have learned. A long dead lady dressed in white is said to walk these woods. You hear a twig snap behind you. You turn and catch a glimpse of something flicker away just at the edge of your sight. And you shit yourself. Not literally, but seriously, trust me, you shit yourself. I've been there, I've been in these situations. And despite my being able to differentiate that something, perhaps it was a bat or a squirrel, you don't quite see it. But despite that something being there, that something, and my being able to distinguish it between that something we don't know and a supernatural entity, which going back to Occam's razor, would require several magnitudes of assumptions, you're still heightened because of the lack of information coming in. Your brain is working extra hard to figure out what's going on, and this leads us to another aspect of our mind's work, the lazy. They really are lazy. As psychologist Daniel Kahneman points out in his brilliant 2011 tour de force, Thinking Fast and Slow, there are two systems that drive human thought. The fast intuitive system 1 and the slow and logical system 2. And system 1 takes significantly less energy than system 2. I'm going to return to the lazy, mistake-prone brain in a while, but let's go back to the woods first. Now imagine being primed and having all that new sensory information assaulting your senses and not being a well thought of and noted skeptic interested in the field. Not only would you shit yourself, but you might very well, if you are so inclined to believe in such things, interpret that something as the lady in white. And I don't mean mistake here. This is a really important point. For all intents and purposes, from your subjective experience, you have seen the ghost. I mean, you haven't. You think you have. Or rather, you believe you have. But for you, for your brain, from the perspective of your conscious experience, you have actually seen a ghost. And this is a subtle point. And many people have made a mistake over the years of thinking I'm sneaking some kind of supernatural belief into this. I'm really not, I promise you. But this is why we need to come back to our species-specific umwelt. The reason that I can specifically say that you haven't seen a ghost, despite your utter conviction and your mind's interpretation that you have, is because we have umwelten as a species, a shared species-wide perspective of reality, where we can cross-reference everything. We can do cross-reference an individual's perception against a species whole. It's why I know I need glasses. And how we can translate different languages. All comes down to the same thing. Because we can cross-reference what we mean. Even if our subjective experiences are slightly different, we have, as a species, developed methods and tools of analysing reality, and we can cross-reference individual experience across time and culture. We can trace alien abduction accounts that share the same characteristics, a fact that at first glance seems to support the experience. But then we trace this description. Let's take the popular descriptions of the grey aliens in modern culture. That most famous example of alleged alien visitors to Earth. And we see their characteristics emerge in science fiction literature as far back as Kevin Follingly's 1891 novel, Mida, A Tale of the Future, and H.G. Wells' 1893 essay, The Man of the Year Million, both of which contain descriptions of beings with large heads and small or frail bodies. And the Swedish novel, The Unknown Danger, by Gustav Sandgren, writing under the pseudonym Gabriel Lind, which gave us a descriptive template, shorter than the average Japanese, and their heads were big and bald, and their eyes large, dark, gleaming. They wore clothes made of soft, grey fabric. In fact, large-headed aliens continued to be a staple of popular culture, with movies like 1953's Invaders from Mars and popular 60s TV shows The Outer Limits in its 1964 episode Keeper of the Purple Twilight, and Star Trek's 1965 pilot The Cage, although that wasn't broadcast until 1988 for any sci-fi geeks amongst you who are going to shout stuff at me later. And of course, the ultimate depiction of small, bulbous-headed aliens is 1977's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So far from the descriptions of aliens with large heads supporting the idea of abductions occur, they tell us something about how we are influenced by ingrained cultural stereotypes, especially when those stereotypes have been popular since the late 19th century. That's a long time for them to become ingrained in our cultural awareness and priming that we think alien visitors should look like, and prime our psychological interpretation when situations occur when we don't have access to that sensory information coming in and our brain is thinking fast, trying to fill in those gaps. On a collective scale, this doesn't cause us too many issues because of our shared umwelten. En masse, we can self-correct and do. And we've invented methods and instruments that will help us do that. And they give us yardsticks by which we can assess our individual reality against the whole. It's why I have corrective lenses and don't constantly bump into walls. because I know that my vision without them is faulty. Were I the only person to be alive, I would take my short-sightedness as standard vision, because I would have no yardstick to go by. In my sample size of 1, I would be normal. And that's what we see with what I will call non-normative claims. From the perspective of your conscious experience, you have actually seen a ghost. And you measure that against the cultural anecdotes that have developed over hundreds of years, which reinforce your beliefs. But these tropes aren't part of our Umwelten. How we consciously perceive the world, or rather they are, but not in the way we think they are. They are primed cultural ideas formed by thinking fast. But when we apply the tools we've developed to correct our cognitive mistake-making brain, we realize that they are illusionary aspects, mistakes in the Umwelten. And that's where I'm going to take you for the final part of my journey into consciousness. We've already discussed that the brain is prone to logical fallacies and how it makes mistakes by cross-referencing external data with the internal model. But what I haven't told you yet is why. We owe the survival of our species to cognitive illusions. It's better to over-interpret coincidences and flee rather than try and work out what the noise behind the tree was and get eaten by a bear. But largely we don't need that in our everyday lives, in our technologically advanced modern world. But it is still there. So where we don't see a bear that isn't there, we construct something else instead. But this is all the result of how the brain develops and why it developed that way. I've not got time to delve deeply into that today, although I will cover it in more detail in the book I am writing, from which this is largely taken, but I do want to give a quick overview of it. The first part of this is going to be speculative. That is my thinking and not established evolutionary neurology, or rather not quite. There are hints, and I want to talk about those hints briefly. Time. Time is important. And I'm not talking about the deep time of evolution here. I'm talking about temporal awareness. For this, I want to travel way back down the evolutionary ladder to single-celled organisms. We are fortunate that we have single-celled organisms we can study today. It gives us a glimpse of what very early life might have been like. And we have studied some of these organisms in detail. One of these is the amoeba, which detect changes in their environment through chemical signals, sound and touch, and make decisions based on those factors. But there's something else the single-celled amoeba seems to have, and that's a memory-based learning. An amoeba doesn't just react, it remembers. And I will suggest that this is a very important factor. The reason I think that it's so important is because it is debated whether they have consciousness or not. They certainly don't have brains or nervous systems. They don't seem to be aware. Now let's jump forward, because there is something else I want to touch on that might relate to this. There's something else that's hotly debated, and that is whether we human beings have free will. Whether or not we choose our decisions, or whether they are temporal impulses that we don't become consciously aware of until after we have committed to them. I want to ask you a question for consideration, and if you come up with the answer, please do let me know, because I have no idea. Genuinely don't. Are we, albeit on an infinitely more complex scale, unconscious slaves to temporal impulse, or are we in control of our own destiny? And how, if at all, is this important in relation to how we operate within our species-specific Umwelt? There are some intriguing papers that might apply to the question of whether we oversee our decision making at all. How decisions are made in different contexts, relying on the combination of different neurotransmitters and hormones affecting behaviour, and how much a mismatch between the internal model and reality leads to errors. These might all inform that will in any form is illusory, but I'll leave that part for your consideration. In the meantime, let's talk more generally. How the human brain develops is something that has taken place over deep time, beginning with primitive neural codes in fish some 500 million years ago, advancing through reptilians having enlarged sensory lobes and early mammals' reliance on more and more advanced systems of memory, then becoming larger and more specialised. In fact, the human brain is the largest and most complex of any living primate. Why it happened the way it did is more speculative. Language and social interaction appear to have played a major part in the rapid growth of the neocortex, which is responsible for sensory processing, motor control, memory, and other higher cognitive functions, such as conscious thought and reasoning abilities. In short, our neocortex allows us to be aware of our unwelt, and that allows us to be conscious of how and why we make cognitive mistakes in the brain's normal operation. And because of this, we can assess why we believe what we do. And that's where I'm going to go now to a conclusion that ties everything I've talked about so far together. So why is this the best way to assess our beliefs? At the beginning of this talk, I wanted to take you on a journey. In the last hour or so, we've taken a whistle-stop tour of philosophy, the universe, and consciousness. It was important to stress that what I have laid out isn't the only way to assess what we believe, what we do. But I do think it's the best. By first understanding what reality is, and then understanding how we relate to it as a species, and then recognising the errors that we make in assessing that reality and the cognitive mistakes that are normal aspects of the way our brains operate, I think we can say that we have a pretty solid foundation for assessing what we believe and why we believe it. Here are the key takeaways that I hope you have an insight into. There is a reality that is objective, that exists externally to our perception, and that all living things are a part, regardless of how they perceive it. That we have a species-specific way of interacting with that reality, which is intrinsically tied to our physical makeup. That the way we interact with that reality is prone to mistakes, and that we have an accurate way to best assess what is likely true despite those mistakes. There were still some big unanswered questions, and when I touched on my disdain of those philosophers who fiercely defend their pet ideas at the beginning of this talk, it wasn't because I dislike them as people. I think they're doing what most people do, trying to elevate themselves into a position of authority. It was because I think it's naive to claim that I have the answer. In a world of so many opinions, many of which are born in incomplete information. My disregard of the strictest form of the hard problem of consciousness isn't because I think it shouldn't be considered, it's because it dismisses an option. One that, given all the information we have, seems to be the most likely option. And that is, for me, bad practice. Really is bad practice. And that point, given the information that we currently have, is a very important one. Our understanding of the universe and consciousness may indeed, likely, will change as more information comes to light. But we must assess it through the information that we have now. Not through speculation, not through what might happen in the future, not through personal experiences that are taken without any kind of thought or consideration of cognitive mistakes that might be being made. Not through currently held beliefs, whether they be religious, philosophical, political, or whatever, but through the currently held information that we have to analyse those subjects. An awareness that we, you, are prone to these mistakes, not just for the big questions, but every day is an important reflective tool that I really do urge you to always practice. Wherever possible, think slow, not fast. And try and spot when priming and preconceived notions push that logical aspect of your thinking aside. I remember one of my own resistant moments well. I've always been a keen lay study. Students, I can't speak, of all things cosmological. And it took me a long time to stop being resistant to the reclassification of Pluto. I'm sure many of you had that feeling as well. Its demotion in 2006 to a dwarf planet. I had no good reason to be resistant to it. I really didn't. I just had a bias, because for me, it had always been a planet. An emotional connection to this astronomical body that really made no difference to my everyday life. Imagine that magnified countless times for a belief that doesn't make a difference to your life. How resistant might people be to realizations that their religious beliefs might be wrong, that they are intrinsically tied to loved ones, friends, community, identity itself. It's because of this that we should have compassionate conversations with those who want to explore these beliefs with us. In my experience, those who seriously want to explore these subjects will agree with what reality is. That part isn't usually a problem. It's convincing them that they might be engaging in cognitive mistakes while assessing their beliefs. We don't want to be wrong. None of us want to be wrong about things. And when we're convinced we are always convinced that we're right. And assessing ourselves is a key to understanding the other people in this respect. When you understand how you feel about being wrong, you will understand why they are so resistant to being wrong. So why is it? What is the best way to assess our beliefs? I think this is the best way to assess our beliefs because it forces us to think. Not simply about the things that we want to think about, but those things that are uncomfortable as well. Why do I believe in the white lady that haunts the woods? Why do I believe that aliens have big heads and little bodies? Why do I believe that this political idea is the best or my religion is the right one? Or that a diesel car is better than an electric one, or that sausage and chips is tastier than a chippy tea? And when we think, we're exposed to having to cross-reference those positions we hold against reality, against our unwelten, and acknowledge any cognitive mistakes that we are making. And it's horrible and it's uncomfortable to expose yourself like that. It really is. And it works. It really does. When you hold up your belief in the white lady against how our brains actually operate, you can see where those mistakes are being made. When you add the principle of Occam's razor and see that to uphold the belief in the white lady, you're not just contending with I believe against I don't believe. But to believe you have multiplication upon multiplication of entities. Life continues after death. Life takes the particular form of a physical body. Specifically the physical body that it occupied. That body still has clothes, so they must have died too. Which means that clothes must somehow go beyond the veil. The spirit is manifested, so must use some form of energy, and on and on and on, with all those extra layers of belief that don't correspond to what we understand reality to be. And it quickly becomes apparent that this belief is built on a very weak foundation. And we can do this for every belief we hold, no matter how mundane it is. And we should do this for every belief that we hold, because that stops us falling prey to scams. It stops us from being hoodwinked into betting on things that we're bound to lose and thinking just this one last time. It guards against us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
That's all right.
So obviously we have gone way over. Sorry about that. So we might want to sort of expedite Q&As. So happy to have got room for a little bit longer. I don't know if you need like just a couple of minutes, or you were to go straight into that.
Yeah, we can go straight into it.
I was actually very interested in the point that you raised regarding consciousness.
Yeah.
And also in relation to belief. So one question I'd like to ask, just to proceed, but I'm wanting to ask is, do you believe that all humans hold beliefs?
Do I believe what,
Do you
sir?
believe that all people, all humans hold belief?
Yeah, I think most people hold beliefs, apart from in extreme cases
And
of...
that's the case with me, because I've got what would be considered full of schizophrenia.
Right.
Physicism, and it took me a long time to realise this is, I don't so much as require beliefs to navigate with the world. What's happening throughout my life, and other people gave me their beliefs. I'm like, no, why, what? And that caused a lot of issues for me, because I just couldn't take on or understand their beliefs. And it took me a long time to realise that, such as to explain to a person instead, it's okay that you believe that, but I don't need to go about my life.
Yeah.
And that's why I had to say, instead, I suppose, just rejecting and challenging, just say, it's fine that they do, but I don't need to, that's the thing. And so I think that's a very important aspect. So a lot of people do go through that, just questioning what the other person believes, thinking, that's not true. It's that you don't need it yourself.
Yeah.
And so explaining instead that you don't need to hold that belief, but it's okay if they do, is how to handle that situation.
Yeah, it would be a fantastic world, wouldn't it, if we did go through life and everyone who had their beliefs didn't feel the need to impose them on everybody else.
And that's the other thing, they always imposing everything.
Yeah.
And that's just got no all the time.
Yeah, it is an unfortunate aspect of being a human being and being a social species. We do have hierarchies and things. There's a fantastic book, I can't remember the name of the author. It's called The 10 Types of Human. It's whoppingly huge. It's the audio book version, something like 26 hours long. It's really, really big, and it talks about it's written by a former human rights lawyer who studies psychology, and he talks about a lot of case studies, his own case studies, and a lot of people he's met in person, people who've been enslaved in Africa, people who have tried to push their religious beliefs on other people, who have come together in their communities, and all these psychological studies that show us that how our being in a community, our being together, is largely what pushes us as a species, and sometimes leads us to do things that we wouldn't normally do, we wouldn't ever consider doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you had to say, particularly around the area of consciousness. And we all, to a certain extent, have, based on whatever beliefs or conclusions or things we've drawn, a picture of reality. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on, in a sense, how open should we be to challenge of our perception of reality? So, for example, the white lady scenario. So we can go into that scenario and then, having already maybe thought about this beforehand, say, I recognise this could just be my mind's playing tricks on me or something because of what I've heard already.
Yeah.
But what if there was a white lady? That is completely outside our experience of reality so far. Is there ever a point where we say, do you know what, this doesn't fit with my view of reality already, but how open should we be to opening our minds to the possibility of something that we've never experienced before being real?
I think it's a great question, I really do. I think we should be very open to it. I think we should always be open to that idea. I think the minute we close ourselves off to something, we really start to restrict ourselves. And there's one photo I took. It's actually a series of 3 photos, but it's of one unexplained phenomena that I took when I was a resident skeptic in a ghost hunting group. I've never had an explanation for it. I don't know what it is. The minute I first reviewed it when I'd finished the investigation, and I came back and I was a couple of days later, I was looking through my photos, I absolutely shit myself. Because I took a photo of just an empty bathroom. This is what I call the control shot, because it clearly shows an empty bathroom. And then the subsequent 2 pictures, there is what can only be described as a big black mass, which blocks out the features behind it. I don't know what it is. There was nothing in the room when I took the photograph. Nothing. And there's just this, your mind goes crazy, and my mind has gone crazy trying to say, it looks like this, and it looks like that, and it looks like the other. If you were predisposed to believing in ghosts and demons and all that thing, you might say it looked like a lady who was bent over with the long hair dangling down that's trying to stand up. Don't have an explanation for it. Genuinely don't know what it was. At that point, I say, this is interesting. I don't know what this is. This might be something that we cannot explain as a species, that we don't have a scientific explanation for.
Would you expect there to be a scientific explanation for that?
I would expect that, going back to this idea of, we have hypotheses and we shouldn't shut things down because we don't have a current explanation for it. I think we've had that throughout, as I said in the Thor example, we've had that throughout history. We might not have an explanation for it now, but as science advances, as the tools we use to, go through and investigate things, as they become subtler and become better at, with this idea about different light frequencies, we can only see so many light frequencies as humans. And when I talked about the mantis shrimp, which has so much more vision capabilities than us, it's very possible that in the future, some technology we might develop some technology which picks something up, and all these things that we experience as these unknown phenomena, these ghost experiences, it actually turns out to be something perfectly natural. But we don't know, and that's the important point. That we should acknowledge we don't know, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And I think they're 2 really, really big takeaways that everybody should kind of, hold to.
I just want to say quickly, the problem regarding ghost experiences, there is aspects regarding some people do have things like psychosis, and they actually can see things that aren't there.
Yeah.
And that causes it to happen as well.
I have a friend who swears to this day that she talks to a ghost on a regular basis.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't believe it at all. However, she's convinced.
And that's the great thing about this, is why I think it's so important for this concept of the Umbelt, this species-specific bubble that we can cross-reference with each other. Because we've got tools that can look into things like psychosis, that can look in, we've got psychologists and psychiatrists who are trained specifically to look into these ideas and differentiate between, is this something that's taking place which is part of psychosis? Or is it something else? Is that person acting in regards to reality, as a shared reality, or are they having some kind of episode that leads them to believe something's happening outside of that? And can we measure that and identify it as something? And it's a great, great sphere of this whole thing of cross-referencing. We need to cross-reference. If we don't cross-reference, we can believe anything, and we can be justified in that belief because we're not trying to say it might be this, or it might be this, or it might be that. I don't know is a perfectly legitimate answer, and sometimes the best one.
It's just the unvelt, is it unvelt?
Unvelt.
And this is, so it's how big is it? Is it just the human species?
It's so all species have their own Umwelt and what's called the Umwelten. And it's as a species, it's our way of perceiving the reality. So, as I said, we can't see certain frequencies of light that mantis shrimp can see. So therefore, that frequency that we're not capable of seeing isn't part of our Umwelten. Dogs have a sensory Umwelten of smell that we don't have. So as a species, their specific Umwelten includes this tremendous sense of smell that we're not capable of assessing. So each species has its own.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you think consciousness is more of a sliding scale? Are we on a continuum somewhere? Have we evolved to almost at the levels of consciousness? Are we somewhere near the highest level of consciousness now?
I would say no. I don't know. It's one of those questions. It's one of those great questions, and I always said the best answers there's never an actual answer to. Best questions there's never an actual answer to, and I think that's one of them. We are where we're at, evolutionarily wise, considering our conscious capabilities. Will that change as we continue to evolve? I think it's inevitable that it will. But whether, even the question of whether it's better or worse, what does that even mean in relation to this? Because it's got to be seen in the perspective of where we're at now. You know, the best consciousness for our ancestors who were walking through the bushes and expecting tigers to attack was to make cognitive mistakes. That's why our brains have developed the way they have. They've developed specifically to make those mistakes because it was useful for our survival. Now, how do you measure that? Because if you're wanting to know as many true things and as few false things as possible, then you want a brain that's capable of recognizing mistakes and not going to fall prey to them. If you're trying not to be eaten by a bear 50,000 years ago, you want those mistakes to be happening. So is there even a way of saying that this is better?
Measure that in terms of having a free will. I mean, even kind of from one species to another, I feel like maybe again it's just me speaking as an arrogant human. You know, like I feel like I have more free will than like a dog who just like his primary function is to like eat, sniff other dogs. I mean, like I feel like they just do what their almost system tells them to do, whereas I feel like I don't go up and sniff other humans because I kind of have that free will.
Should try it sometime, it's fun. Yeah, and again another great question because it's an I don't know answer. Do we even have free will? I don't know.
I actually do have an answer to that, and that actually comes into, I don't know if you've read about memetics. Memetics is a study of how ideas spread from one person to another, and it's also believed that once you hold a certain belief, whatever that is, it's more so that you're not necessarily making the free will to do as you're doing, you're making that choice through the belief that you hold. And it's more so that in some cases people can be controlled by the belief that they hold and having to go about their life according to their belief, as opposed to making a free will choice themselves. Whereas a free will choice would be, this belief or this idea says I have to do this or not, I have an option to say yes or no. But under the belief system, you only have the option for yes, because if you pick the no option, there's some kind of imagined punishment, or other people might punish you, such as, if I don't do this, I'll go to hell. So at that point, it becomes, in my opinion, not a free will choice because of being controlled by the belief. And that's the aspects of what's called memetics, and that was began. That idea came up in Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. It's not a book that I've read so much, but so much as just read the general idea of how ideas and beliefs spread, and how, according to those beliefs, the person will end up doing what they do due to that belief.
Yeah, that works in the context of a specific setting. So if you're talking about specific beliefs in specific things, where religion is a good one to do that with, because we can largely analyse it. Even though it's not as easy as a lot of people think. Trust me, if you do a degree in religious studies, you will know it is very convoluted sometimes. But yeah, I think it works in specific circumstances like that. I think to the question you were asking, this larger idea as a species, as an evolutionary tool, I'm not sure how much that would actually work. I think it works in relation to specific thoughts rather than this whole idea as a species, a developing species.
Well, it would interest us also, like different people have different thoughts, different beliefs. Why do those spread? Why do people have those differences in cognition? And why do they act upon set beliefs that can be identified between us? So two people might have the same belief. These two people might have the same belief. They go about one thing the same way, they go about it a different way. And it's more so, is it based on the belief, or is it based on their actually making the free will to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really is.